in Cuba. Here he was as he landed.
It's been nearly 90 years since a U.S. president stepped foot in Cuba. It is wonderful to be here.
This is day 2 of the president's 3-day visit, the culmination of a diplomatic thaw the president and his Cuban counterpart Castro announced more than a year ago. We begin our coverage with Al Jazeera's Melissa Chan in Havana.
Well, the biggest event of Monday is going to be President Obama's bilateral meeting with Raul Castro. I also think it's important to mention that he is not going to be meeting Fidel Castro. Now, the two presumably are going to assess the progress of normalization, their new bilateral relationship, the fact that they have, of course, established or reestablished diplomatic ties. Now, for the goal of President Obama, very much on this trip, it is symbolism to a certain extent because he's thinking about his legacy, but he's also considering the possibility Republican or Democrat, mindful almost in terms of the changes that we have seen in the U.S.-Cuba relationship over the past 14, 15 months. Now, on Tuesday morning, President Obama is going to be meeting with dissidents, human rights activists in this country. According to the activists, they have said that the Cuban government has actually detained more people. There's been an increase of detentions over the past few months. So that really places everything in context. The argument for U.S. engagement with Cuba is economic liberalization that would then eventually lead to political liberalization. But the signal from the Castro government is that they are still very much in control and not going to liberalize anytime soon on the political front. But of course, for most Cubans, the dissidents are the minorities. Most Cubans, by and large, support normalization. They find President Obama very popular, and the vast majority of Cubans are also, of course, very much against the American embargo.
Al Jazeera's Melissa Chan in Havana, and we are getting a live. He will be meeting with Raul Castro, so we're watching some of the pomp and circumstance take place right now. A new CBS News and New York Times poll shows that a majority of Americans (6 in 10) support restoring diplomatic relations between Americans are interested in visiting Cuba. We're joined now by Robert Valencia, who writes about U.S. relations with Latin America for Global Voices. He joins us from Washington. Robert, good to have you with us. Thanks for your time. What is the value of this trip for President Obama and for Raul Castro?
Well, thank you again for this is just a way to say, you know, we are welcoming new relations. This is the time where the Cold War has long ended and it's been long overdue to reestablish new relationships. I think this is going to be a victory lap for President Obama, who has scored important diplomatic victories, you know, in the world. I mean, let's look at the nuclear deal that the United States and other powers signed with Iran, and I think that's very important. I mean, of course, we have Syria, but that's an unresolved issue, unfortunately. But this is a way to show, and for Raul Castro, this is a possibility to show that he is really committed to implementing changes in 2018.
I want to ask you this. This is the 4th time that Castro and Obama will be meeting. How much leverage does President Obama actually have in this relationship when it comes to issues of, for example, human rights?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and that's one of the sticky points during this visit. I think President Obama was trying to make establish an approach with President Raul Castro the first time when during Nelson Mandela's funeral, and many saw that as a good omen for change. now to have, been incarcerated for just expressing their opinions against the Castro regime. I think this is really important that the president stays on message, that he is there to talk to the Cuban population, to the dissidents, so that a new, I wouldn't call it revolution, but really a call to conscience. I think that's why the presence of President Obama in Havana is so important.
Just want to reference these pictures that we're seeing live. Extraordinary seeing the Cuban military band playing the Star-Spangled Banner. And here we see a wreath laying. This is at the Jose Marti Memorial, of significance to a lot of Cubans there. This is part of what we will see the president do today before he meets with Raul Castro in a one-on-one meeting, which you refer to, Robert. How much is the president's overture toward Cuba really about U.S. influence as a counterweight to countries such as Venezuela and even to China?
That is correct. One argument is a lot of people make is that Cuba is such a small market. There's little benefit for the United States. I mean, there's only 11 million people. It's time. If you go to Havana, you see that there are still, 1950 Chevy models running on the streets of Havana. The infrastructure is crippling. But I think it's such a symbolic act when you had Cuba trying to be part of hemispheric affairs, but they were banned from attending the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena and previous summits of the Americas, except the one that took place last year in Panama. So certainly Latin America welcomes this new approach. The Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos actually tweeted yesterday, the new installment in U.S.-Cuba relations. Same thing with Argentina and states, including Bolivia. So it could have a domino effect so that other countries who are not that friendly with the United States, such as Nicaragua, Bolivia, Venezuela, might, join the problem, so that the entire hemisphere will face common problems together.
Robert Valencia, who has reported extensively from saying a few words, he's supposed to walk from this location to the presidential palace. How far is that? And talk a little bit more about what we've just seen.
Well, what we're seeing right now is President Obama is walking through the Plaza de la Revolucion. And this is the area in which 3 popes have spoken. We sort of have those mass gatherings. A couple years ago, you sort of have the Peace Without Borders concert. So it's an area of historic significance, also because this is an area where Fidel Castro used to give his hours-long speeches. You see in the background there, you'll see the mural of Che Guevara, you'll see Camilo Cienfuegos. These are sort of icons of the revolution. And to see a sitting president of the United States walking through that plaza, right by what you're seeing right now, this is Jose Marti statue, who was considered sort of a George Washington figure of the Cuban Revolution that actually was sort of railing against the imperialist policies of both the Spanish colonial empire at the time. But this area is sort of iconic Cuba. A sitting president walking through that area and basically saying, the United States and Cuba are sort of open to this. This is a historic moment.
Is there irony in that symbolism as you view it?
I'm sure that President Obama's opponents, the Senator Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio's, and certainly Donald Trump, will look at this as sort of a moment in which President Obama is sort of apologizing for 50 years of policy. And that is certainly how the Castro government is viewing this. They haven't done a lot in terms of human rights issues that has really been sort of the sticking point for trade relations between these two countries. Not only the detention of Alan Gross in years past, but what we've seen of the dissidents being rounded up, just like we saw dissidents being rounded up prior to the Pope's visit. There's a concern by this government of having mass gatherings, and who knows if they would cheer Obama, maybe they'd cheer USA.
Yeah.
Those are questions that the Castro government is really not willing to take.
We heard Robert Valencia sort of talk about the symbolism of this meeting between Castro and Obama, but what is Obama really going to get out of it? Will he get any short-term concessions on human rights or on other issues when it comes to, for example, American businesses being able to do business in Cuba?
If there's a quid pro quo here, it doesn't look like it. When you look at what President Obama is trying to do, he's sort of establish just what Melissa Chan says, sort of establish his legacy and also make it difficult to sort of roll back some of the regulatory changes they have.
So what he's doing is laying the groundwork for sort of a post-Castro era? Is that what this is really about?
I think on the surface of it, that's exactly what's happening. But on sort of a subterranean level of this, you'll see, at least in terms of trade with Cuba actually dropped 41% between 2015 and 2014. It was down 8% in January compared to last year. So despite all this normalization of trade has actually diminished in recent years. And yet we start to see American companies, the Starwood, starting to partner with
Starwood
a hotel.
Hotels, yeah.
Right, with a Hotel Inglaterra. This was a hotel that was built in 1875. Winston Churchill went there during the Spanish-American...
And an American hotel chain is going to be...
American hotel chain, but also that American hotel chain might actually be purchased by a Chinese insurance market. So what we're looking at here is Chinese influence in Latin America that is doubling down, exponentially rising over the next couple of years, at least projected to. And American influence has been waning in this area. So this is not only an opportunity to sort of push back some of those old ties of the Cold War past, but also sort of reestablish the United States as a true power broker in terms of trade in the region that is sort of abandoned, at least when it comes to Cuba. Cuba, of course, is a market of 11 million people, a lot of agricultural land that's been untapped. The John Deeres want to be able to get in there. The Microsoft have been trying to establish an office there. And Google, even recently, has been talking about opening up hotspots in the island. So a lot of potential for economic opportunity.
It's happening fast, but perhaps not fast enough, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the hour. David Ariosto, thank you. Stay with us. Much more of our coverage of President Obama in Cuba coming up. Right now, the president is at the Jose Marti Memorial signing the guest book. From there, as we said, he will walk to the Palacio de Revolucion to meet with Cuban President Raul Castro. Much more from Havana and the significance of this trip coming up live. Also ahead this morning, clearing the air with some key constituents. Donald Trump heads to Washington today, trying to win over a key voting bloc. I want to go live now to our Mike Vaquera, who is on the ground in Havana. Mike, tell us what the atmosphere is like on the second day of President Obama's visit.
Well, I can tell you among the Cuban people here in Havana, there is excitement. A lot of people staying away, a heavy security presence here. But the people that culture holds, they say enough of the animosity, enough of the more than years of a trade and political and diplomatic embargo. On the U.S. side, I have to tell you, Stephanie, there is some concern about the optics of this visit. There's a lot of stagecraft, a lot of choreography. We saw last night, as soon as the president got off the plane with his spring-breaking daughters, as well as Robinson, they went to Old Havana for what was supposed to be a grand, very dramatic and beautiful pictures of the president symbolically opening these doors to the Cuban government between the United States and Cuba, again, after some 54 years of estrangement. It was pouring rain, however, and it really sort of, in a quite literal sense, rained on their parade. But that was nothing in comparison to the protest. Earlier that day, it happens every Sunday, a group of dissidents here in Cuba known as Ladies in White. They are protesting the detention of some of the people that they have known, perhaps their family members. They were protesting, as they do most often, every Sunday, but they were detained and arrested. It was quite a scene by Cuban security officials as well as some counter-protesters. I spoke with White House officials last night. They were very concerned about the optics of that. They've been very sensitive to criticism that they have not paid enough attention to the dissident community here. That not only comes from Republicans, it comes from some Cuban Americans in South Florida and elsewhere, and it even comes from some of the groups, including the leader of that group, Ladies in White here in Cuba, who thinks that President Obama is making a mistake. Now, I should add that the Cuban government and many Cubans believe that these dissident groups are wholly bought and paid for by elements outside the United States, including the United States government. And so you get a feeling here that there is a great deal of concern on the part of the White House. They don't like the way that happened. However, the show goes on today. There is a lot of pomp and ceremony. You just mentioned that the president laying a wreath at the statue, the memorial for Jose Marti, the famous, heroic in the eyes of Cubans, 19th century Cuban nationalist advocating independence from Spain. Then the president goes to the big event, a bilateral with President Raul Castro. There will be very shortly here an opening ceremony and a ceremony at the Plaza de Revolucion, the site, we might add, where Fidel Castro gave countless speeches, anti-imperialist speeches, anti-United States speeches. So ironies abound here, history abounds, but again, something of another minor controversy in the eyes of some, a major in the eyes of others. They will have a press conference, will these two presidents, Stephanie, and yet there will be no questions taken. And it is well known that the White House pressed the Cuban government to allow a full-fledged press conference where there could be a give and take with questions from reporters. As far as we understand, the status of that request now is no. This is simply going to be statements lasting just a few minutes between the two presidents. After that, there is a state dinner, but in between those two events, the president will attend an entrepreneurial summit. Stephanie, he's got a number here. The hospitality industry well represented, Airbnb, Starwood, Marriott, those two companies announced today, as Xerox, PayPal, on down the line, more than a dozen of them. There are also several American politicians here. We saw several of them in the hotel last night, even a few Republicans along for the ride, but mostly Democrats. An entrepreneurial summit, I should say, the president is holding in the afternoon with American CEOs and Cuban business interests. So a full slate of activity, and of course tomorrow, the president does have a speech to the Cuban people before he attends a baseball game, the much ballyhooed contest now between the Tampa Bay Rays, the Major League Baseball, and the Cuban national team. Stephanie?
Mike, you talk about some of the complications with the optics, especially of those protest rallies and the arrests that happened subsequently. It's been less than 24 hours since Air Force One landed in Havana. Based on what has happened so far, what are the White House's expectations of this visit? Is this going to be Obama's going to China moment?
Well, you know, the White House has said many times that what they're trying to do is give a feeling of permanence to what the president has done, which, after all, has been an executive order that could be reversed by his successor come next year, come next January 20th, when his successor is sworn in. The president has said many times he's confident that that will be a Democrat, but if it isn't, then a Republican would have every opportunity to reverse what the president has done in normalizing relations. You remember, it was that dramatic announcement.
Formal welcoming for the President of the United States in Cuba.
Let's face it, if you've got wood, you've got scratches. Don't get mad. Scratch Aid, the wood scratch mender by Dutch Glow. It's the perfect match for any scratch. For all your precious wood furniture, flooring, and doors back to life. Watch closely. We took a meat cleaver to this expensive table to show how Scratch Aid can make even extreme scratches disappear. Look close. The damage treated with Scratch Aid.
We're getting from inside the presidential palace right now, a bit of a shaky camera shot. Okay, so we're panning over here to the Cuban military, which is part of this state visit. You can see there on the left, Secretary of State John Kerry, as well as other members of the U.S. cabinet. President Obama has just shaken the hand of Raul Castro. It is the fourth meeting between these two leaders. I just want to bring in Al Jazeera's David Ariosto, who has covered Cuba extensively, was there just a few months ago. David, talk about the significance of this event. A sitting U.S. president, as you said, in the presidential palace, in the seat of government here in Cuba.
Well, following up on something Mike mentioned, is the optics really matter on something like this. Back in December of 2014, when President Obama gave his speech announcing the normalization relations, he wore a dark suit, spoke for about 10-15 minutes. Raul Castro, his counterpart, wore military fatigue, spoke for only about 5 minutes. And so it was almost a sense of conveying that this is still very much a Cold War. You see these pictures now, however, both men are wearing dark civilian suits. This is, it gives you a sense of what kind of rapprochement we're looking at here. The two shaking hands in the palace. This is obviously the seat of government here. It's quite a historic moment. You really can't sort of overstate how big a moment of this is. The last time being, obviously, in 1928, Calvin Coolidge sailing down there in the Texas battleship. This is being a very different situation now. They obviously, Calvin Coolidge showing up at that point to sort of create a greater rapprochement in terms of how Cuba and the United States were meeting. There was some discord there, but with his
very
family,
different circumstances.
different circumstances, and coming with his family, showing up, walking down with Sasha, Malia, and the First Lady, and now shaking the hands of President Raul Castro, who will leave office in 2018. So sort of what comes next and what this sort of proceeds in terms of this evolving relationship between these two countries. This is a major start. This is a moment. There's been many moments. We've had 3 popes, 1 former president, and countless fictional speeches in the very plaza where President Obama was walking earlier, but this is a moment that hasn't happened since the 1920s.
And there they are walking through this hall. I imagine that he'll do a review of troops, which is pretty normal for state visits like these. I want to go back out to our senior White House correspondent, Mike Vaquero, standing by in Havana as we sort of see these pictures unfold. Mike, I'm just curious how this is being covered in the Cuban media and what access Cubans have to seeing these events unfold.
Well, again, that is something that has been a concern of the White House. After all, the point here is to expose the ordinary Cuban person to the president, his message, and what he has to say. One of the sticking points as they negotiated over the course of the first few months of last year between the Cuban government and the American government in trying to open those embassies was the Americans wanted their diplomats to have freer travel throughout Cuba so they could have that exposure, so they could promote not only American values, American ideals in terms of politics and civil liberties, but also obviously American economic interests as well. I have visited with a couple of different individuals over the course of the last few days. A restaurant owner the other night who's got a very sort of chic, modern restaurant. Full disclosure, I was having dinner there, but a lot of expatriates were there. And I was talking to him, and he said, you know what, business has boomed over the course of the last 3 months or so, over the course of the last months. But a part of his problem is, and here's the irony, and perhaps illustrates what's going on here in Cuba, there are still vestiges of the old command-style economy, the Soviet economy, if you will. They can't find things. He can't find produce. He can't find the things he needs to keep a restaurant running. So he says he just has to get creative every day, not only with his menu, but with the physical operation of running a restaurant. I also visited with a family yesterday living in a very small, 3 generations, a very small apartment in downtown Havana, not far from where the president was touring last night. They're all aware that the fact that the president is coming here. They hope and are hopeful that all these years of animosity were pointless. They can finally be put behind them, and they're hopeful for the young people. There were 2 small boys in the apartment, hopeful that they can reap the fruits, the benefits of what is happening here today.
Mike, let's just take a pause here and listen as the Star-Spangled Banner is played.
Descansen. Armas. Para recibir por la derecha. Presenten. Armas.
Okay, so as the review of troops begins here, I want to bring in Robert Valencia again, who has been commenting all morning about the significance of this moment. Robert, a lot has been said that President Obama in some ways is legitimizing a dictator here with this visit. When you look at these pictures, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's one of the biggest criticisms, that President Obama has received is that he is shaking the hands of Raul Castro while he's smiling at cameras, and that's considered a big slap in the faces of the many people who have sacrificed their lives when they're trying to cross the Strait of Florida, or the dissidents who have really, put their lives at stake. But I think this is just, as we've heard, this is all about aesthetics, it's all about images. The moment in which both nations have been, come together after 50 years of political and diplomatic strain brings a lot of memories in terms of all the diplomatic tensions that have happened in the last couple of years. For example, the Elian Gonzalez case in 2000, when he was technically brought back to Cuba to live with his father. We have the other incident not too long ago in 2012, the so-called Sunsuneo, which was a version of Twitter provided and sponsored by the State Department, by the USAID. And that caused a lot of tension between the United States and Cuba, who has tried to, in a way, delegitimize the government, the Cuban government. And we have, multiple cases like TV Marti, who is a channel that is run from the United States and that has plagued the airwaves in Cuba with U.S. propaganda, if you call it like that. So there has been a lot of tensions. You see all these incidents in the last couple of decades, but now it seems like everything is forgotten. And as the guest has mentioned, Raul Castro will be leaving power in 2018. However, many are skeptical about what's going to happen after this, because I'm pretty sure that the Castro regime, the Castro brothers, will be placing someone who is akin to the Cuban Revolution, like Miguel Angel Diaz-Canel, or anyone who has been deeply involved with the revolution and the regime.
I want to bring in Al Jazeera's David Ariosto on this topic of sort of political transition within Cuba. We've talked about whether President Obama is sort of laying the groundwork for a post-Castro Cuba. How realistic is that?
Well, what's interesting is President Obama just shook the hand of Diaz-Canel, who's considered to be sort of the heir apparent in 2018. So, this is an individual who's a hardliner within the Castro party. What's interesting is if you look at the embargo, and if you look particularly at the Helms-Burton Act, because the embargo is a series of different acts, about 4 of them ever dating back to 1960, but Helms-Burton really codifies a lot of this. And there's a clause within Helms-Burton that essentially says a full normalization of relations can't take place between the United States and Cuba as long as there's a Castro at the top of government.
Castro, specifically a Castro.
Right, exactly.
Well, there won't be a Castro necessarily after 2018.
Here's the tricky part, however, is that Raul Castro is pledged to step down. However, it's not clear whether he's going to step down from the Communist Party. And within the Cuban Constitution, the Communist Party is always supreme to the Cuban government. So while the letter of the law says the government, with the Diaz-Canel, that there might be some possibility of actually lifting the trade embargo after more than half a century, it's not really clear whether Castro will actually not be holding the reins of the Cuban government here. And that's going to become sort of a political decision.
As we look at the military pictures here, I just want to talk about this sort of nexus between government and the military, David, because Ted Cruz, in his rebuttal, in his criticism of this visit, talked about how the military, they're really the ones holding the purse strings. They're really the ones with the keys to the economy there. Right. Is that true?
It very much is true. Cuba has similar to what you might see in terms of an Egyptian model, where the army is infused in terms of every single part of the economy, particularly the hotels. You'll go and essentially at the very top of some of these hotel chains are military men. So, when we talk about trade, when we talk about the Starwoods, when we talk about the Marriotts, ultimately they're going to have to be partnering with not only the Cuban government, but the Cuban military. And that is a very difficult line to toe when you talk about the politics of South Florida, New Jersey. Even though 6 to 7 Americans say they want a normalization of relations, it's this military that has been sort of at the forefront of tapping down some of those human rights that many people have been talking about. We discussed the ladies in white earlier. These are basically the wives, the mothers, the girlfriends, the sisters of a group of dissidents that were imprisoned back in 2003. It was called the Black Spring. And these people were held over the course of a decade. Now, Cuba doesn't really do that as much anymore, these sort of long-term detentions, but they still detain people in kind of these catch-and-release programs. And that essentially is very much against what human rights groups say is what is needed for sort of a rapprochement between these two countries. So what happens next? It's not just a handshake. It's not just symbolism. These optics really matter in terms of policy as we go forward and what these next steps will be between these two countries.
David, thank you. Taking a live look now at the Cuban flag flying in the wind on a stormy day in a less than stormy relationship, I would say, these days. I want to bring back Robert Valencia for some final comments on what we've seen today and what lies ahead. Robert, I think what this really always comes down to is the president saying he hopes to make life a little better for Cubans. How much evidence have we seen in the last 18 months since the détente was announced in December of 2014 that has actually improved the life of average Cubans?
Well, we've heard previously that business are booming in Havana. There has been an approach, especially from some U.S. officials. I mean, you saw, for example, Governor Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York, visiting Havana, visiting Cuba as well, and promote what New York, the state of New York, has to offer to the island. Now we're seeing airlines, U.S. airlines such as United, even Southwest, are trying to open new routes to Havana, from Havana to New York, Washington, and Miami. So there has been absolutely an approach to both Cuba and the United States. You have seen an improvement in. I mean, obviously things are not going to happen overnight. I mean, we're talking about 50 years of complete estrangement. Things are beginning to thaw. restrictions will have to ease, and that's exactly what President Obama is looking for. Now, in terms of lifting the embargo of what Cubans call the bloqueo or blockade, still is pending because Congress will have, it's calling the shots on whether they should be lifted or not. You were mentioning we have the election cycle, and you have Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton supporting the lifting of the embargo, whereas the Republican Party is completely opposing on lifting the embargo and easing the relationships between the United States and Cuba. So things are not going to happen immediately, but this is such a big, bold step, and it's a necessary step.
Thank you very much, Robert Valencia. I want to go back out to Mike Vaquera, who is live in Havana. Mike, I just want to talk a little bit about the politics of this, because we've discussed how this is a presidential year. How much political capital did President Obama spend on this détente with Cuba, a lot of which these rules on trade and travel he has changed through executive action?
You know, the term political capital, when you're in the last year of your second term, I think takes on a different meaning. Again, I think what the president is trying to do is cement this perception that things are normalized. He wants to do that while there is obviously a lot of substance and a lot on the line here in terms of both civil liberties and economic opportunities for Cubans as well as American nations. He wants to create this perception, and again, through the use of a lot of the optics that we're going to see over the course of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, that this is now the status quo. The United States and Cuba now have normal diplomatic relations, and while the White House doesn't concede that Congress will not lift the embargo over the course of the next, 8 months until the president leaves office, it's very unlikely, it's probably impossible that Republicans are going to undertake that in an election year. Nevertheless, part of the goal here, I would say perhaps even the main goal, is for the president to show the world that the United States and Cuba are now having normal diplomatic relations, if not normal economic relations. But again, things have not gone perfectly for the White House here. There's the relatively minor issue with the weather. The skies opened up. The moment Air Force One touched down yesterday in Havana, the skies opened up, the umbrellas went up, and the president and the first family marched around Old Havana going on a tour there, somewhat obscured by umbrellas and somewhat literally dampened by what was going on with the weather. But more significantly, and in terms of the fuel for the criticism that we've already seen, front page of the New York Times today doesn't mention anything. Well, the lead is, the headline is the protesters that we've already talked about, the ladies in white, adding more fuel to the critics, the Republicans and those in Florida and elsewhere in the Cuban American community. And while those attitudes, as David and others have discussed, have shifted dramatically over the course of the last several years in terms of whether or not they support the continued poor relations or the opening to Cuba that the president has embarked on in a very visual way, there is this perception, this idea, out now by the pictures of those protests and those individuals being arrested, that the president has promised a lot in terms of the influence the United States can have on opening up Cuba to civil liberties, and the reality on the ground from Human Rights Watch and a lot of other third-party organizations that things really haven't changed that much at all, Stephanie.
And we're going to continue to thank you, but this really comes down to two leaders. And Cuba's President Raul Castro, who is younger than Fidel and has plotted a different course than his brother, mending fences with America. Al Jazeera's Lucia Newman has that part of the story.
In size, in style, and in character, Raul Castro could not be more different from the brother he replaced as president of communist Cuba. Raul and Fidel Castro fought to overthrow the Batista dictatorship, but it was Fidel who set the future course.
Cuba y la revolución cubana,
punctuated by fiery anti-American speeches, so long they broke the Guinness Book of Records.
Fidel had a vision, and he didn't want anything to affect that vision. He placed a lot of importance in the ideological reason, in the ideological component of the revolution.
For nearly 50 years, Raul Castro's older brother was the unchallenged supreme leader of the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro focused on the creation of the so-called new man and blamed the United States for Cuba's shortcomings. And when poor health forced him to step down, most assumed that Raul Castro, who had always stood in his shadows, would simply follow in his footsteps.
To almost everyone's surprise, in just 8 years, he has introduced a series of long-awaited reforms, from letting Cubans open up small private businesses to loosening restrictions on travel abroad.
Raul has been more liberal. There's been more democracy, a lot of reforms. We have to open up.
Raul Castro is above all a pragmatist.
Raul Castro is more like, you know, we have to solve the beans and the rice for the Cuban people. For Raul, he thinks that the revolution must be saved by obtaining results that affect the life of the people.
He is in fact pragmatic enough to put ideology and years of mistrust aside in order to reconcile with the revolution's archenemy. But Raul Castro is equally committed to maintaining Cuba as a one-party communist state.
The same way we have never suggested the United States change its political system, we demand respect for ours.
Raul Castro is due to step down in 2 years. And with the clock ticking on the Castro era, he seems determined to follow Vietnam's example. Make peace with the United States, open up the economy, maintain the grip on political power. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Havana.
I want to talk a little bit more about Raul Castro with our correspondent, David Ariosto. David, do you think that when Raul Castro took Fidel's place in 2008, people knew that he would put these reforms in place? It's that we would see a day like today where an American president is shaking hands and having a face-to-face meeting with Raul?
I think when he first took over, there was a concern that he might not actually last in power. A government with Fidel Castro not at the top, that was something that nobody had known for half a century, and there was concern that he might be sacked. So what he did was essentially sacked other government ministers, put them under house arrest. But what he did after that was start to implement a series of liberalizing reforms that kind of ran under the radar in many ways. They didn't make headlines in the United States or around the world, but they were slow agricultural reforms that were really desperate at that point, because Cuba, throughout its history, has always kind of been reliant upon another power, whether it was the Soviet Union prior to 1990, whether it was Venezuela, really up until recently in terms of the oil subsidies.
Well, Maduro just met with Fidel. The president of Venezuela just met with Fidel Castro yesterday, and what was interesting is that they put out publicly the photos of that meeting. Do you think that was time to send a message?
Oh, absolutely it was timed. I mean, at one point there was even talk about Hugo Chavez, when he was alive, actually giving one of what's akin to the State of the Union within Cuba. I mean, just the thought of that in terms of the connection between these two countries, and the fact that the United States still has sanctions lobbed against Venezuela. So Maduro traveling to Cuba is almost like a hey, me too moment.
But he doesn't have the leverage that he once did because of falling oil prices, right?
Because of falling oil prices. That has really crippled his government in many ways, and it's basically also put Cuba in a sense that we really have to look to a secondary source of income. That could be American tourism. You can't call it tourism now. It's people-to-people exchanges, but these are really kind of semantics. People are traveling down there, and Cuba needs that cash because they have been cash-strapped for a while now, and because of these falling oil prices, they were facing the prospect of even being more so.
How has the Castro dynasty managed to hold on to power for so long?
You know, I think part of it is the fact that Cuba's an island. It literally is an island, so it can control its borders a lot easier. You don't have that sort of that free movement of trains like you might have in Colombia or Venezuela, but also the fact that these two brothers have been people described as sort of the perfect yin and yang of leadership. Fidel would get up and give these 7-hour speeches, and he was very charismatic. And Raul really hasn't given many interviews at all, and he's much more of a pragmatist, much more of a technocrat, and he sort of worked behind the scenes in implementing the visions of Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, and of course Raul Castro during the course of this. So you have the bombastic Fidel Castro, and you had the technocrat Raul Castro, creating almost what is sort of a perfect ability to maintain power for over half a century.
And an American president who was open to the idea of warming relations. David, thank you. More live coverage of President Obama's trip to Cuba right after this. Obama's trip to Cuba. Right now, he is inside the presidential palace, meeting one-on-one with President Raul Castro. But part of President Obama's agenda today also includes meeting with Cuban entrepreneurs. And 2 American businessmen will be there as well. Al Jazeera's Melissa Chan has their story.
All revolutions start with just a few individuals.
So if you look at the tractor, you can see it is very, very simple.
And they start with a mission, which for Horace Clemens and Saul Barenthal is to sell this tractor to as many Cubans as possible. They are the very first Americans granted permission by the U.S. government to build a factory in Cuba.
When we looked at what's the best business to go into Cuba, we said, well, we need to help them increase food productivity.
Theirs is the first significant investment project by U.S. business on the island since the Cuban Revolution. The two hope to eventually produce so many tractors, they'll start exporting them to other countries in South America.
So if we achieve those goals, we will be in the hundreds of thousands of units a year and employ 300 people or more.
But at a cost of $8,000 to $10,000 US, it's not clear whether many Cuban farmers can afford the tractor. Some stopped by just to window shop.
Yes, there are those who can afford it, but me, for example, I can't afford it, but there are others who can.
Clemens is hoping that international NGOs or the Cuban exile community in America may be able to help local farmers buy his tractors. This booth is the only one at the agricultural fair from the United States. It really is breaking new ground. All the other booths represent Cuban domestic companies, or a few are from Europe.
You know, there's money to be made. I mean, this is a country of 11 million people. It's not the biggest market in the world, but 11 million people is about the size, population-wise, of Illinois, where I live, and that's the 6th largest state in the union. So there are a lot of opportunities.
Soon, it won't be just tractors. Other American businesses plan to enter the market. Support for the embargo is eroding fast, and business interests, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, have called to end it.
Our entire foreign policy has been focused on Fidel Castro, where it should be focused on the 11 million Cubans. And I think that's the shift that we've seen over the last 12 months.
The impact of the American embargo on ordinary Cubans is tough to assess. But as many Cubans blame the embargo for their hardship as those who blame their own government. Out in the countryside, farmers' best options are often dilapidated, decades-old Russian imports. New tractors would improve lives.
All our machinery is old, and we need to upgrade and improve our technology in order to advance, in order to move forward. We need to make progress.
Para avanzar se necesita progresar. Clemens believes a prosperous Cuba will arrive very soon.
If we look at what's happened in China and Vietnam, where they changed their business model, I tell everybody that Cuba will move faster than either one of those for the simple reason of the Cuban people.
People may debate whether change will take a few years or a few decades, but no one questions that Cuba will look very different for the next generation. Melissa Chan, Al Jazeera, Havana.
Bringing back Al Jazeera's David Ariosto for a comment about this. So there will be investment going into Cuba, but the investment will be uneven. What will that mean for the Cuban economy?
Well, you look at what's coming in. You look at tractors like this. You see different investments from companies. But then you also look at remittances. And remittances are sort of a major component of this economy. It's a billion-dollar industry. But the people who have ties to those companies, both the United States and in terms of remittances, are often usually the white Cubans. So when you look at the divide in terms of where this investment rises and where it falls, it's uneven, and it's uneven racially. So what we might start to see is sort of these haves and have-nots break down along racial lines, and this egalitarian system that we've talked about in terms of what Fidel Castro and Raul Castro have tried to put forward over the course of what is defined as Cuban communism, could actually potentially be undermined by some of this policy that the Obama administration is putting in. So it's almost like over 50 years of trying to change Cuban communism through an outside foreign policy approach, maybe this administration is simply trying to change it from within.
A very interesting comment. I want to get Robert Valencia's opinion on that. He writes about U.S. relations with Latin America for Global Voices. Robert, what do you think about that? What American investment in Cuba will do to the Cuban economy and to maybe the social strata there as well?
I think everything has been explained. I think what I see is how U.S. investment in Cuba will have repercussions across the region, particularly in the Caribbean. Let's look at Puerto Rico, for example. They're facing tough economic hardship. They are at a multi-billion-dollar deficit. And many are questioning whether a new economy in Cuba will represent a boon or economic woes for Puerto Rico. Whether Puerto Ricans who are professionals can go to Cuba and improve the infrastructure of Cubans and vice versa, or whether Puerto Rican tourism industry will be affected by a new opening in U.S.-Cuba relations. So certainly, there's a lot at stake. A lot of things are gonna be happening in the next couple of years. Whether Latin America will see a new surge in Cuban economy, because let's not forget, before the revolution, Cuba was a beacon of progress in Latin America. They were the first country to bring television and railroads in Latin America, and we'll see hopefully a new era of progress. But a lot of things are still at the back burner. You have Guantanamo Bay, you have the Cuban Adjustment Law, so many things are still discussed. But I think this is such a historic moment, and we should not let it go unnoticed.
Robert Valencia with Global Voices, thanks so much for joining us with your insight. Last time to Mike Vicario, wrap up.